Hello, everybody. It's a pretty good crowd. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Clapping always helps. So, as you said, I want to dive into the deep beauty, as I call it, of contradictory advice. Because especially for those of you who are just getting started or have startups of your own, you're going to hear a ton of different stuff. Said a little bit about me. My name is Matt Mullenweg. I am best known for co-founding 12 years ago when I was 19, a project called WordPress, which is an open source blogging system. You can use it to make blogs or websites or pretty much anything you imagine on the web. And then just about 10 years ago, I founded, and WordPress runs about 24% of all websites now. About 10 years ago, I founded a company called Automattic, which does WordPress.com, Jetpack, and also products like SimpleNote that you can run on your phone. Automattic takes a pretty unusual approach to things. We are currently about 390 people spread across 44 countries and 272 cities. And we like to do a lot with a small amount of people. This is actually a chart we have on our recruiting page, showing that you can have a big impact even with a relatively small team. And how we do that is by listening to lots of mutually exclusive advice. So I'm going to go through some of the things that you might have heard and relate them to some of my experiences, including some quotes from famous entrepreneurs that we all admire, and then ended up with some things that you can actually use to navigate this sort of, the sirens of mutually exclusive advice. So first, you probably all heard this. Don't innovate too many things at once, or own your stack. Obsess on every detail. This actually is something, the one on the left, is something I heard very, very early in WordPress's or Automattic's journey. I was raising money down in Palo Alto, and I was telling the investor how, in addition to creating this open source blogging software, and being a distributed company that worked with people all over the world and no office, we were also going to have this virtual currency that you could, Tony might remember this, there's going to be a virtual currency that you could sort of trade for things. There'd be virtual goods, it'd be like ringtones, and there were like 20 different things that were going on because I was really into economics, and I wanted to create this sort of parallel Second Life-like economy. And he said, Matt, you're doing a lot already. Try not to innovate on too many things at one given time. You're already doing this distributed open source blah, blah, blah thing. Maybe you don't need a currency yet. You can do the currency later. So I followed the one on the left, and it worked out pretty well. But later down the road, we saw that, for example, building our entire stack from a technology point of view today allows us to save millions and millions of dollars every single month over if we were just using stock Amazon Web Services. So these are things that I followed both sides of it. So there's no answers yet. The answers come at the end. Next, I have a Steve Jobs quote. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. Sounds nice, right? We should all love what we do. I have another quote from noted entrepreneur and investor Ben Horowitz. As a startup CEO, I slept like a baby. I woke up every 2 hours and cried. Both of these guys are right. This is kind of the duality of what we hear all the time. How can you be doing what you love if you're waking up every 2 hours and crying? I think it would be a stretch for anyone to say that during this period, and I believe this was LoudCloud, was the company Ben Horowitz was at when he was referring to this, probably wasn't enjoying it that much, but he kept working on it. So think about why. Raise money when you can get it versus bootstrap as long as possible. Again, something where I followed both sides of this. In the beginning, Automattic was bootstrapped for its first few months. Then we raised $1 million. Fast forward, we ended up not raising money in between 2008 to 2014. So we didn't have any outside capital. But then, when I became CEO, it was obvious that there were certain things that we were foregoing because we didn't have the capital needed to invest in certain areas of the business. And I hadn't really realized the opportunity cost of what we were missing. So in 2014, we raised $160 million, which is a lot of money, almost like an IPO. But in my head, I was very glad that we hadn't raised it any of the years prior. In fact, we had looked at doing something in 2010, 2011, and decided against it, decided to just grow the business based on the revenues. This is especially crucial in the beginning times. So you will hear very conflicting advice on whether when you're small and you're just getting started, because that was a late stage story. When you're very, very in the very beginning, is the money going to be something that will be gas in the tank, and useful? Obviously not the focus, but the thing that gets you to point A to B. One of my favorite quotes about that is actually from Tim O'Reilly, where he says, money is like the gas in your car. You, on a road trip, you stop at gas stations along the way, but the point of the road trip is not to visit gas stations, right? It's to get from one place to another. I will also add to that gas in your tank helps you move faster. If you douse your car in gasoline, you're just going to catch on fire. And so too much money can definitely be something that causes your car to catch on fire. Think about this one. If you just work on stuff that you like and you're passionate about, you don't have to have a master plan with how things will play out. Mark Zuckerberg, and it seems to have played out very well for him. Steve Jobs in 1995 said that he had a perfect plan for Apple. If anyone would listen to him, he could execute it. And then Reid Hoffman says the best entrepreneurs I've worked with engage in serious planning and strategy. Where I fall on this one is that I believe that plans are mostly useless, but planning is absolutely invaluable. The act of planning forces you to take sort of a 10,000-foot approach to your assumptions about the business, the things that you're working on, the sort of, if you are successful, what has to happen in between point A and B from budget points of view, staffing point of view, technology point of view. So that planning process is hugely invaluable. But if you just stick to that plan without modifying it, you run the risk of, again, especially if you have a ton of funding, gasoline in your car, you might move very, very fast in the wrong direction. And then by the time anyone notices, you're 5 miles off course and it's too far to get back. There's a fine balance between having conviction in what you're doing and being stubborn. I'm probably stubborn more often than not. And this is another bit of contradictory advice. I think I took it out of here, but just the idea that you should sort of stick to your guns. And the story is about like an Airbnb, like 20, 30 investors rejected them, but they stuck to their plans, versus people who maybe their original plan wasn't what ended up working out. It could have been the programming languages for Microsoft with our operating systems, or the home-built computers for Apple, or any number of examples over the years. Focus on revenue versus focus on growth. Who's ever run into this one? Who's thinking about this right now, actually? Focusing on revenue versus focusing on growth. I'll give you the arguments for both sides. Focusing on growth, you can always figure out revenue later. And there's so many examples of companies, Twitter perhaps being, or Facebook, both being amazing recent examples, maybe Snapchat today, of companies that had a ton of users and no money. And everyone was like, well, how will they ever monetize? With Twitter particularly, they said this. Twitter's now doing billions of dollars per quarter, so they figured that out. Or on the revenue side, people say, well, you should beta test your business plan at the same time you beta test your product. It's so common to have something that becomes popular, but they never figure out how to provide the value that gets people to actually open their wallets. And you hear talk about the penny gap, right? The distance between $0 and 1 penny is far bigger than the distance between a penny and $10 or $20 or $100, because it's so hard to get people to take out that credit card the first time. On this, I tend to fall on the focus on revenue side, because when you're in the black, time is on your side, and when you're in the red, time is working against you. There's literally a clock ticking at what point your company will run out of money. And there's many businesses, many reasons for failure, but for almost every business that fails, running out of money was a big part of it. Here's an Arianna Huffington quote. She said, "Fearlessness is like a muscle. I know from my own life that the more I exercise, the more natural it becomes to not let my fears run me." It's actually pretty inspiring, right, to not let fears run your life. On the other side, we have billionaire Mark Cuban. "Fear of failure motivates me more than anything." Different strokes for different folks. Another Mark Cuban, since we're running a little low on time, he says, when you've got 10,000 people trying to do the same thing, why would you want to be number 10,001? There's an amazing counterexample to this, which is Google was the 15th search engine when it launched in 1997. And actually, in my own experience, many people, WordPress was founded in 2003. People just sort of assume it was always this large consideration. But in fact, when it started, the biggest criticism I got wasn't about the software or anything like that. It was that the market was too crowded. There were so many CMSs out there, and blogging systems, and open source CMSs, that there was no room for anything else. And in fact, when Automattic launched a few years later, every single internet giant at the time, Yahoo, AOL, Microsoft, and Google had a blogging system that was doing exactly what we were doing. And our competitor at the time, which was a company named 6apart, had about 300 or so employees and an overwhelming market share. So there was really nothing indicating that 4 or 5 guys from an open source project were going to have any impact. But we did it anyway. So I've given you lots of examples of contradictory advice, and haven't really given you the answers for what to choose on either side. But the font got cut off there. But this is going to be 6 rules for things to actually listen to. So first off, when you're getting contradictory advice, or any advice really, doesn't even need to be contradictory, remember the context. So each of the quotes especially the quotes I showed you, was taking place for that entrepreneur or that investor at a particular time, with a particular set of circumstances, with a particular set of experience, and a broader environment. Perhaps it is an order of magnitude cheaper to run infrastructure than it used to be. So perhaps focusing on growth for the first 6 or 12 months of your company might make sense because the cost of actually running the business is so much lower because you can use cloud services and mobile devices and everything like that. So always remember the context. Second is to know the survivorship bias. Does anyone know what the survivorship bias is? It's actually pretty fascinating. So the survivorship bias is basically that often the people that are on stage are the ones who survived everything. And it could be because they made a bad decision and had a good outcome, or it could be because they made good decisions. And honestly, you're never going to know. Because if I hadn't been successful, I could have followed all the advice and done all the sort of things I said, but if I hadn't been successful, I wouldn't be here on stage in front of you. And so when you hear advice like a CEO's on stage being like, never give up. Well, by definition, they didn't give up or they wouldn't be up there on stage. But there were lots of people who never gave up and didn't make it. In fact, far, 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 far more than you'll ever hear from. So just keep the survivorship bias in mind. The second is another bias called the halo effect. Actually, my favorite page on the Wikipedia is the list of cognitive biases. If you read and understand every cognitive bias on that Wikipedia page, you will be ahead of 99% of the people in the world. So the halo effect is our tendency to ascribe positive characteristics to people who we like or brands who we like. One of the stereotypical examples of this, or classic examples, was Cisco. Pre-boom, sort of call it 99, 2000, and post-boom. Pre-boom, everyone's like, Cisco is brilliant. They're able to acquire companies quickly. Don't have a not invented here syndrome. They're fine, going out and integrating things, and it's really, really powerful how they do these acquisitions. John Chambers was on the cover of Forbes. Just 2 years later, the exact same writer, the exact same journalist, was writing about how Cisco was unfocused. They weren't able to create any technology, so they had to buy everything. There were these fiefdoms of competing. So the exact same strategy when the stock was high and when the stock was low was seen with a halo effect on both ends. Number 4 is to synthesize. So what that means is to cherry pick. I love reading actually Stoic philosophers and old books like Ben Franklin, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. But you cannot follow anything in there literally. Not just because it was thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago. But again, the context was completely different, and that's rule number 1, remember the context. So cherry pick. Take the best bits of what you think from everything you read or everything you hear, and try to apply it to your situation. But only take the things that make sense to you, or that seem like they might be powerful and have an impact on what you're doing. And the best tool for that is actually the next one, which is to work from first principles and don't reason from analogy. This is something that probably the most famous advocate of this is Elon Musk. And he talks about that the conventional wisdom when they were doing Tesla and looking at batteries was that batteries would cost $600, $700 a kilowatt hour. But what are the first principles? What is actually in the battery? Don't just look at how other people, the analogy of what batteries cost other people. And if you look at the spot market prices for nickel, copper, all this stuff that's in batteries, the raw materials are only about $80 a kilowatt hour. So there's a gap there, and perhaps with hard work you can figure out how to close that $600 to $80 gap. Always think of these. A first principle basically means it's something that on its own you can derive it as kind of a universal truth. And then when you build up from that, you don't have to look at what anyone else has done, any examples, even your own intuition to follow it. And then the final and very most important rule is if the advice comes from me, to ignore it. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.